Hello, I am Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is based on more than 15 years of marking experience for the Matric WCED external examinations and 20 years of marking in a school setting. And what I've tried to do is to summarize 10 of the best ways in which you can improve your creative writing. So that is your narrative, descriptive, and reflective writing. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and find it useful, particularly for Section A of the writing paper, that's paper 3. But please remember that many of the techniques that I discuss also apply to discursive and argumentative writing, as well as transactional writing. I will create a separate presentation on the writing paper as a whole, and short presentations on each of the important transactional writing formats, as well as a presentation on how to write a discursive or argumentative essay, which is also the same structure as a literature essay. As I said, this presentation focuses on useful skills for writing a narrative essay. That's an essay where you tell a story. For descriptive writing, where you would describe a place or a person. Or reflective writing, where you reflect on or think about an event or a person that has had a major influence on you. I will create separate presentations that focus on reflective writing in a little bit more detail, but it is worth remembering that those three genres or types of writing, narrative, descriptive, and reflective, work very well together, and you will often combine elements of all three, and that really isn't a problem. Tip number 1, for good writing, work through the whole of the writing process. Remember that all writers who are good writers follow a process when they write, and that their writing undergoes many changes between their first idea and what is finally published. How much they do or don't edit is not a mark of how good they are as a writer. So you must never worry about how many times you cross out and how many times you rewrite. The process that the WCED recommends is a good one, and I've arranged my tips around this process. Remember, the more you think, the better you're going to ink. Your writing can only improve with planning and drafting and editing and revising. You will usually have an hour to complete a formal in-class writing assessment, and the Matric writing examination is a 3-hour paper. Because you also have to write 2 transactional texts during the course of that examination, you should complete your Section A essay in an hour and a half, which is definitely enough time to work through the writing process and to produce your best possible writing. Note that the process has 5 stages: plan, draft, revise, edit, and present. And I'm going to talk you through each stage and give you tips for each stage so that you can finally produce your best writing. The first step is planning, and this quote, "Write without fear, then edit without mercy," gives you a very good summary of the process you need to follow in order to write well. If you try to edit while you are writing, you'll find that you give yourself a terrible case of writer's block. It's always best to get your ideas onto the page, and after that, edit them very carefully and critically. You might be wondering why you're staring at a picture of a brain. Well, it's thought that in right-handed people, the left hemisphere of the brain deals with logic, language analysis, analytical thinking, and structured tasks, while the right hemisphere is more focused on creativity, intuition, artistic tasks, and holistic thinking. Although your brain generally uses both sides for most higher-order tasks, you are going to get better results if you don't play the 2 sides of your brain off against one another, which is why it's a good idea to start with your creative brain and let it be in the driving seat. And then when you've finished with that, follow up with your editing, correcting, logical, critical left brain. And that way you will get the best out of both sides of your brain. Tip number 2, write from your own experience and write about what you care about. Now, it's important to realize that you can write about just about anything as long as you care about it. But if you don't care, your marker or your reader definitely won't care about it either. So it's generally a good idea to choose a topic where you have a strong emotional response, because you will then be able to inject those emotions into your writing. As a marker, or even as someone who enjoys reading, you expect good writing to be believable and to convince you that what is being described could happen, or has actually happened. Remember that as a writer, you're a kind of travel agent. You want to take your reader on a journey into a world that you describe. And if you don't know that world in detail, your reader will never ever be able to experience it. So the key to writing that is convincing is detail. I've marked many essays where people describe things like giving birth or being in a car accident or thinking that their home was burgled. And what's always convinced me about their writing is the little details that only a person who'd gone through those events or had witnessed those events would actually know about. Good writers, or people that know what they're talking about, are able to describe the sights, sounds, and sometimes even the sensations, smells, and tastes that are associated with the event that they're describing. They're able to give specific detail because they've been there. Now, that doesn't mean that great writers have actually experienced every last event that they describe. But if they haven't experienced a particular event or setting or historical period, then they first do a whole lot of research so that they know the world that they are writing about really well before they start to write. And you might be wondering, well, what do science fiction writers do? I mean, they can hardly go and do actual research. But they will actually spend hours creating the world that they're going to write about and documenting it so that when they write, they can give specific, consistent detail. They will do things like write out a vocab for the language that they're inventing, drawing a map of the terrain that their story is happening in, making character sketches of the different characters and how many tentacles they've got and how many eyeballs they've got, for example. So they do get to know what they're writing about before they write about it. The second characteristic that markers and readers look for is originality. And that's linked to a really important idea, which is integrity, or being true to yourself and having your own voice. And if you write in your own voice, if you write your own truth, you will be original and convincing. Remember that your perspective of the world, no matter who you are, is totally unique. And it's probably the only thing that is totally unique about you and original about you. And it is what will make your writing interesting. So good writing is not about cramming as many murders, rapes, robberies, and other dramatic events like car chases into your story as you possibly can. And also remember that it can be considered to actually be offensive to write from the perspective of a person, particularly if they are from a different racial or cultural group to you, especially if you are writing from a position of privilege or you are basing your writing on ignorance or stereotype perspectives. Be really careful of doing this. And remember that in the matric final exam, there are literally tens of thousands of other candidates. And there will be many people who actually are from that group whose perspective you've usurped. And because they've actually lived the life that they're describing, they're going to be able to write far more convincingly about what they're writing about. So where possible, stick to your own lived experience. According to Donald Murray, a famous writer who wrote extensively on the writing process, I write to say I am, discover who I am, create life, understand my life, slay my dragons. So one thing I would really like you to get out of this presentation is that by the end of it, I hope that you see writing is an opportunity for you to speak your truth and find your own voice. And your writing is your opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with your reader. And it is the only time in your life where you are actually able to create an entire world and be in complete control of it. So enjoy your power. As I said previously, you should always choose a topic where you've had a strong emotional response, because then you will be able to inject those emotions into your writing. Remember, you need to care if your reader is going to care. The only topics that I would advise you to steer clear of are attempts to convert your reader or marker to your religious or political viewpoint, as they may have different beliefs to you and they could get very offended. Also remember that you're trying to write a short story or a narrative or descriptive essay or a reflective essay. You are not auditioning for a role as a priest, a pastor, a minister, or a politician. It's also a good idea not to write about sex. Different people have different opinions on what is or is not appropriate, but adults generally feel uncomfortable hearing about sex from learners, and some may feel that your writing is offensive or even pornographic. Have a look at the pictures on the slide and think of a time when you felt cared for, or you felt rage, great sadness, fear, loneliness, or joy. And I'd like you to do this because you will usually find that you can write very effectively about an event where you felt those kind of emotions, because they had a big impact on you at the time. Once you've thought about the event that you can write on, stop this presentation, jot down some notes, and then when I finished speaking, flip onto the next slide. Remember that if you're completing a writing assessment or a writing examination, you're going to be given a choice of topics. Read through them all very carefully and don't ignore the picture-based topics. And then choose a topic that can be linked to an event or something that you wish to describe, where you have strong enough feelings and actually care about what you're going to write about. Remember that emotions are universal, so you should definitely then be able to find a topic that you can work with. Also remember, you must only choose one topic, and you must make a clear link between your topic in the assessment and the subject of your essay. So at this point, stop this presentation, think about a recent event from your own experience where you felt perhaps one of those strong emotions, jot down some notes, and then when you are ready, go on to the next slide for the next step. Number 3, imagine what you will write about in detail before you write, so that your description is as realistic as possible. Consider this. All of the information that you have about the world comes to you through your senses. Therefore, if you want to take your reader into a world that you describe, you need to give them the sensory information that they need so that they can imagine what you're describing. I challenge you to try this exercise so that you can see how well it works. Once you've decided what event you want to describe, sit somewhere quiet, close your eyes, and imagine yourself living through that event in as much detail as possible. Try and run the event or events like a movie in your head. Think about what you would see if you were there. Think about what you would hear, taste, smell, touch, and finally, what emotions you would feel. You can think about the environment in which the event takes place and imagine it in as much detail as possible. If there are any people or living creatures involved, think about how each of them would look, sound, move, and perhaps even smell. When you've imagined your scene in as much detail as possible, flip over to the next slide. Tip number 4, jot down as many ideas as possible, very importantly, without editing, because you do not want to give yourself writer's block. So, stop this presentation and jot down your ideas as fast as possible. Don't edit them at all. Write everything down, even if it feels a bit stupid. Remember, you don't have to write in full sentences. You don't have to worry about how tidy your handwriting is at this stage. All you want to do is to transfer what you were imagining onto the page as fast as possible. And if you find that you're writing down 7 words that all mean the same thing, just write them all down as they pop into your head. If you suddenly think of an amazing simile, metaphor, or personification, write it down. If you suddenly realize an important piece of information about one of your characters that you want to describe, or about the topic of your descriptive writing, write it down. That's all you're doing. You're just writing down as much as you can, as fast as you can, and in as much detail as you can. And you are not editing it yet. The second step is drafting. According to the writer Donald Murray, the longer I write, the more important I believe it is to write the first draft as fast as possible. In drafting, I push myself so that I am at the edge of discomfort. Later, it will be time for consideration and reconsideration, slow, careful revision and editing. And Donald Murray is one of the world's most famous and best known authors about the process of writing. So once you've got your ideas and first impressions down on paper, then it's time to start crafting them. As you write and as you draft and craft, you will find that more and more better ideas occur to you, and that you usually gradually realize what you want to say and exactly how it should be said. As you look at the next slide, ask yourself which of the two ways of looking at the world is going to work better if you are writing a narrative, descriptive, or reflective essay of only 400 to 450 words, which is the word limit in the matric final examination. Tip number 5, keep it limited. I hope that you said that the approach with the magnifying glass would work far better when you only have 400 to 450 words to work with. If you try to describe too many events, cover too much time, or write about too many characters in only 400 to 450 words, the best that you will manage is a very brief and very boring summary. Instead, choose between 1 and 3 events that didn't take too much time to occur and only involved 1 or 2 main characters. For example, if you tried to describe what living through 6 years of World War II felt like in a 450-word essay, you would have approximately 75 words to describe each year, an impossible task, even if you were Shakespeare. And the same thing happens if you try and fit an account of a rape, a robbery, a murder, a car chase, having a baby, and dying of cancer into one 400 to 450-word essay. You will not write convincingly. Instead, you will write what looks like a summary of a really bad night of really bad television. Rather, what you should try and do is write about something that you know that didn't take very long. For example, you could write about the 5 minutes where you sat in the dentist's waiting room and you heard screaming and choking on the other side of the door. And then the moment of relief you felt when the door opened and you realized that the dentist had been watching something on his phone with the volume turned up, and that he hadn't actually been murdering his patients, he'd just been catching up on his Netflix. You will then be able to write in convincing detail because you will have enough words with which to do so. And there is also a chance that you actually know what it feels like to be terrified of the dentist. So look at the ideas that you've just jotted down and draft a plan for your whole essay so that you are only describing a few events that took a short amount of time and only involved 1 or 2 characters. And make sure that you're telling your story from the very first sentence, that your audience is involved and interested. And remember that your whole job as a writer of a short story is to zoom in and give enough detail to make it believable and convincing. Tip number 6, use the story mountain to plan. If you think about the difference between a list of random events and a story, long or short, it is that a story has got a problem or a complication. If I get out of bed, get dressed, go to work, come home from work and go to bed, that's just a list of events and it's really boring. It becomes a story if there's some problem along the way that makes the reader wonder what's going to happen next. Think of how long the Bible is. It starts with one of humanity's oldest stories. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and Eve is tempted to disobey God and eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. This temptation is the complication of the story, and according to the Bible and the Quran and the Torah, it led to the following thousands of years of human history and human suffering, because that was the moment when sin, death, and suffering were introduced into the world. If the complication of Eve eating from the tree of knowledge had not occurred, the Bible would have been an exceptionally short book. Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden. They were totally happy and ate lots of fruit forever and ever. Amen. The end. It's a happy story, but it wouldn't make for great literature. In terms of the story mountain structure, the beginning or introduction sets the scene. For example, I'm peacefully asleep in my bed, and then I wake up and start to get out of bed. If, as I get out of bed, my foot touches the floor and something bites me on the ankle, there is now a complication in the story. This is an unusual event, and it raises questions. I realize that something is next to my bed, and that it is possibly aggressive. Now the reader's going to start wondering what bit me, where it came from. Am I still going to go to work? Am I safe? Will I get rabies? The ankle biter is the complication or the problem, and it leads to an increase in tension for the reader because they're curious and wondering what's going to happen next. The height of the tension or the point of greatest tension is the climax of the story. And as an author, you can stop your story at this point. This is known as a cliffhanger ending because it's like leaving your character hanging onto a cliff by their fingernails, and the reader doesn't know if they're going to be able to scramble to the top and save themselves or if they will fall to their death. This structure is much loved by the producers of TV serial programs because it keeps people coming back to see what the next episode will be about. For example, will the girl realize that the mysterious stranger she's kissing is actually her best friend's long-lost husband? Most stories, however, answer some of the reader's questions, which leads to a decrease in tension, or the falling action. And the last event in the story portrays the character or characters as having changed in some way because of the events in the story. This story mountain structure is a great tool for planning a narrative or a reflective essay. For example, you could draw the mountain and bullet point what you're going to include for each stage of the story. Or you could have a look at the list of ideas that you just jotted down in the previous slide and mark the content that you want for the different stages of the story mountain in different colors. A reflective essay will tell the story quite briefly and then consist mainly of reflection on the lessons learned and how you changed between the beginning of the story and the resolution. If you choose to write an entirely descriptive essay, this story mountain structure won't actually be of any use to you. However, the remaining tips that I will describe in this presentation will be very useful. Also remember that the story mountain structure is very useful for the study of literature, as you can map out the plot of your drama or novel as you read. Remember that a drama, novel, or a longer story will usually include several story mountains, each with its own complication, and sometimes separate story mountains for different characters that may even run in parallel. You can think of your longer texts as being story mountain ranges, and I really hope that this is a useful technique for you. Picture the story about the great writer Ernest Hemingway. One day he was supposedly sitting in his favorite bar in Cuba when his friends placed a bet that he would never be able to write a short story in 6 words. Apparently Hemingway knocked back his drink, lit up a huge cigar, and called for a paper napkin. He then wrote these 6 words on the napkin: "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." He won his bet, and his friends had to buy him drinks for weeks afterwards. And he won the bet because this is a short story. The introduction is the fact that a pair of baby shoes is for sale. The implied complication lies in the words "never worn." We are left to wonder, did the baby die? Was it given up for adoption or stolen? Or did it just hate wearing shoes? This is a cliffhanger story because our questions are not answered, so the story stops at the climax. However, it works as a short story structure because it makes us curious. So before you apply the story mountain structure to the ideas that you previously jotted down, see if you can write your own 15-word short story. And remember, as you have 15 words, you should try to include all 5 elements: the introduction, complication, rising action, climax, and then, of course, the falling action and resolution. And once you've managed that, check your structure for your narrative or reflective essay. Are you building tension? Are you making the reader curious, which is a good thing, rather than confused, which is a bad thing, because that means that parts of your essay are not logical? And by the way, the Hemingway story, although it's a fabulous one, it probably didn't happen. There are stories about the story from before Hemingway was born, but I think it is a beautiful illustration of the power of the short story structure. Tip number 7. Carefully consider the order of events and tenses that you are going to use in your writing. It's a very good idea to decide on the order of events in your short story before you start writing, as this will save you a lot of time. Remember that the simplest structure is a chronological structure. So basically you say this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But you want to be very careful not to say then over and over again, because it becomes incredibly boring and repetitive. So not a story that goes, I woke up, then I got out of bed, then I went to work, then I crashed the car, for example. So, for example, you could describe the day that you discovered that your parents have decided that they're going to move overseas to Germany, and that within a week you're going to be in a new school having to learn in German, which you don't speak. You could then have a new paragraph where you describe the move and the trauma and how you felt about it, and then a third paragraph where you describe your first day in a German school. A flashback structure works in much the same way as the flashbacks in movies. For example, you could describe a moment when you're sitting in a taxi and a boy that bullied you in junior school climbs into the taxi and sits in the seat in front of you. This would be followed by a paragraph in the past tense where you're remembering how he used to wait for you behind the classroom, beating you up and stealing your lunch. You would then revert back to the present tense and you describe how he turns around in the taxi, looks you straight in the face, and you realize that he has a black eye. Your next paragraph would be back to the past tense and you describe a memory of the boy's father grabbing him by the shoulders and shaking him violently in the car park. Your final paragraph, back to the present tense, you would look at him and say, we need to talk. Because now you understand something about him and why he behaved the way that he did. A circular ending could be the same story, but it would start and end with a taxi ride, where you understand far more about the boy on the later taxi ride. So basing your writing on a symbol is another suggestion, and it's a very, very effective technique that I'm going to explain in more detail in the next slide. Another important decision that you must make, along with deciding on how you will structure your story, is to decide on the tense or tenses that you are going to write in. Remember that the past tense works very well for reflective writing because you're looking back at an event and reflecting on or thinking about it, while the present tense generally creates a bit more tension and excitement because your reader feels as though they are living through events as they happen. Try the challenge on the next slide and see what you come up with. I hope that you enjoy it. I challenge you to write a story based on a central symbol. Describe how you felt about one of these objects at 3 different points in your life. And obviously in a test or an exam, you could choose any symbol or object that is linked to one of the questions. So for example, I could describe how irritated I used to get with trying to brush my youngest daughter's hair in the morning. I used to literally have to catch her and try to force the brush through hair that had paint and press stick and sometimes bits of last night's dinner in it. Her hair was always full of knots, and she and I argued about it every day until it reached the point where both of us agreed that it would be a lot more painless if we just cut her hair really short. My second paragraph could be where I describe brushing her hair for her the night before her matric dance and how our relationship has changed. Now she actually asks me to brush her hair. And we have a conversation about how quickly her schooling has come and gone, and how she enjoys me helping her to get dressed for her matric dance. Finally, my third paragraph could describe me putting her onto a plane as she leaves home to live in another country. And the last sight I have of her as she climbs onto the plane is this mop of wild curls being caught by Cape Town's southeaster wind and blowing over her face as she turns to wave goodbye before climbing onto the plane. Because her face is covered, I can't see what she has said to me through the glass windows of the airport terminal. And then when I climb into the car, I realize that she's forgotten her hairbrush on the front seat. And I pick it up and I look at some of her curly hair caught in the tines of the brush, and I hold that brush and I weep. So you can see that this is a very simple but very effective structure to use for narrative, descriptive, or reflective writing. And I challenge you to now stop the presentation and have a go at doing this for yourself. Tip number 8, choose a narrator or point of view. Remember the difference between a first-person and a third-person narrator. A first-person narrator is a character in a story, and the events in the story actually happen to them. They will use I and we because they are actually involved in the plot. If you write from the perspective of a first-person narrator, remember that your narrator's viewpoint will be limited. You can only tell your reader or audience about things that the narrator themselves has experienced, and that the narrator cannot actually know about everything that is happening in the novel. Their perspective will also be biased because they will have their own particular opinions, which will obviously influence the way that they see things. These can be great strengths for certain kinds of stories because the reader might be able to infer or work out more than the narrator or storyteller is actually telling them. And the reader might not even agree with the views of the narrator or the storyteller. So this is a great way to build tension and to make your story exciting. So one option is to just write with a single first-person narrator. Another option is to go for a third-person narrator. Now, a third-person narrator is one that is outside of the story. These narrators are sometimes described as omniscient, which is Latin for all-seeing, or as having a God's eye view. As a third-person narrator is outside of the story, they never use I or we. And of course, there's nothing that a third-person narrator cannot know because they have this God's eye, all-seeing view. And they tend to be a little less opinionated than a first-person narrator. Those qualities can be very, very useful, especially if you're telling a complicated story. Remember, no matter what type of structure or narrator you choose, you must start a new paragraph whenever you start something new. So every time you describe a new event, a new character, a new time or tense, a new place, a new idea, or you are writing dialogue that is spoken by a new speaker, you must start a new paragraph. A couple of other interesting options are to have multiple first-person narrators. That's a really interesting technique when they are all describing the same event, but they have very different viewpoints on it. Or alternating first and third-person narrators. So you would switch between a very subjective, opinionated viewpoint and a very objective, detached, all-knowing viewpoint. So I hope you enjoy experimenting with those. Here is another challenge based on point of view and choice of narrators. So for this challenge, choose 3 or 4 different characters from the picture below and describe what they're witnessing and how they feel about it from their unique and presumably biased first-person point of view. As you describe your character's view on the event, try to show what kind of person they are based on what they say and how they see the world. Their way of seeing the world should show the reader something about their age, social and cultural background, opinions, and personality. For example, how does the clown feel as he supports the acrobat while she holds onto the ring? How does the acrobat feel about the clown? What is the woman at the entrance of the tent thinking and feeling about what's going on inside the tent? See if you can create tension or a story from the contrasts or conflicts between the different ways in which the different characters see the same event. Another interesting exercise is to do this in a group, where everyone in your group chooses a different character and writes about that event that is depicted from a very different point of view. And then you weave those stories together and you see how they contrast and the tension that they create. We now reach the third stage of the writing process, revising. And Patricia Fuller says, writing without revising is the literary equivalent of waltzing gaily out of the house in your underwear. I think Ms. Fuller is right, and that this is very accurate. Revising is the written equivalent of making sure that you're properly and appropriately dressed before you set out, or if you're using social media, before you press send. And we all know what happens if you don't edit carefully and revise carefully before you press send on social media. Always revise and edit your work very carefully so that you know that it is as well written as you can make it before you send it out into the world. Remember that your writing represents you and you don't want your writing to embarrass you. Tip number 9 is show, don't tell. This is possibly the most effective technique in your writing toolbox. Think about which of these two descriptions makes you feel more strongly about the two characters and why. The first description, the girl was upset with her history mark. And the second description, Sarah pictured telling her mother that she had finally managed to get a good mark for a history essay, and her mother being happy enough to get out of bed. A small smile tugged at Sarah's mouth. As Mr. McGraw's heavy tread got louder, her throat tightened, and the thumping in her neck sped up. When the footsteps stopped, she looked up, beaming. Mr. McGraw gazed down at her, his mouth like a buttonhole. Sarah's hands, clenched in her lap, started to shake. She watched her paper float gradually out of his hand onto the graffiti-scarred wooden desk. 17%, and an angry face emoji seemed to burn into her eyes. Her blue scrawl began to blur and run down the page. Mr. McGraw heaved a heavy sigh, and his footsteps faded away. Think about which description makes you feel more strongly about these characters and why you felt like that. You would have noticed that the second description didn't use the words upset, but we know that Sarah was first excited and then bitterly disappointed. Look at all the information that was showed to you rather than told to you in the second description. We realize that Sarah struggles with history, that she desperately wants to please her mother, who seems to be either too sick or too depressed to get out of bed. She's having a difficult time at home, but she tries hard at school. Mr. McGraw makes her nervous, and he's mean and unsympathetic. Think about the shape of a buttonhole, and that if Mr. McGraw's mouth is that shape, flat and thin, what does that say about his feelings? He doesn't seem to know or care about how he can help Sarah or notice that she's trying, but she is struggling and unhappy. He doesn't seem to consider that maybe her struggles with history are not because of history, but because of her situation at home. And when she starts to cry, he just sighs and walks away. You would have also perhaps picked up that Sarah's school is not very well maintained, and that discipline is possibly lacking because students are able to graffiti all over the desk. Can you see how imagery, specific information, and detailed descriptive language can communicate a lot of detail and create a far more interesting story if you show rather than tell? And unlike in the first description, with the second description, you will have some sort of emotional reaction to Sarah, whereas the first description, I can more or less guarantee you just don't care. Tip number 9, show, don't tell, continued. Again, think about which is the more effective description. The woman was aggressive and unreasonable, or she reared back, nostrils flaring, and started to shout. What do you mean red wine is not on special? I am a teacher and this is an emergency, and the Constitution guarantees my right to food. I've been following social media and I know exactly what's been going on ever since the government banned alcohol during COVID. Her pale blue eyes bulged and her knuckles whitened on the handles of her trolley. Chest heaving, she thrust her face at the cashier, who strained backwards on his chair and inched his hand towards the buzzer under his counter. I demand my rights. I will have my box wine at 70 Rand. So again, I would like you to think about which description makes you feel more strongly about these two characters and why. You will notice that the second description never uses the words aggressive or unreasonable. It does not tell you that the woman is aggressive or unreasonable, but you are in no doubt that this is an accurate description of the woman because it shows you that she is aggressive and unreasonable. And the way that it shows you is largely through her dialogue. She actually shows you simply because we get to hear her speak. And from the words in her dialogue, you can work out a lot of information. Firstly, she's quite possibly an alcoholic. Secondly, she's a teacher, and teaching throughout COVID probably tipped her into a state of paranoia and possibly madness. She seemed to spend a lot of time on social media. She's a believer in conspiracy theories. She doesn't support the current government, and she's determined to protect her own rights, whilst ironically completely ignoring the rights of others and the cashier. The cashier thinks that she's completely mad and possibly dangerous because he leans away from her and tries to quietly call his supervisor using the buzzer under his desk. He's trying to protect himself. So can you see how dialogue and detailed descriptive language can communicate a lot of information, a lot of detail, and create an interesting story? Also take note of how the direct speech was paragraphed and punctuated on the slide. First of all, note that a character's exact words are always in quotation marks, and the punctuation that applies to their words, that tells you how they spoke, is also inside the quotation marks. Notice that every time a new speech or a few lines of descriptive language begin again, you must leave a blank line and start a new paragraph. Remember, paragraphs are always about something is new. That's what it's flagging to the reader. Note that well-written dialogue is a very effective way to show rather than tell a story. But don't make the mistake of writing your entire essay in dialogue. You must include some descriptive language in between. So, a general summary of what you should do if you are using tip number 9, showing not telling. The ways in which you can do this are to use sensory imagery to give specific information, particularly adjectives and adverbs, to use effective metaphors, similes, or personification, but please don't use these just for the sake of it, and don't overdo them, and don't mix them up, because then your writing just becomes confusing and overly complicated. And it's also often a good idea to use dialogue to show character and to drive your plot along. Did you notice that I didn't use particularly big words or elaborate language in the previous two descriptions? Always remember that effective writing is about using the right words, not the biggest words you know. And it's about focusing on how effectively you are communicating. Communication is your first duty. Remember that showing, not telling, is one of your most powerful and effective tools as a writer. I challenge you to this challenge. Once I've stopped talking, I suggest that you stop the slides and have a go at this. So the challenge is to practice your showing rather than telling by describing an object or creature accurately enough so that a friend can guess what it is that you are describing. And remember, you want to show it, not tell your friend what it is. So techniques that you can use to show rather than tell are sensory imagery, specific information such as adjectives and adverbs, and effective metaphors, similes, or personifications. Stage 4 of the writing process is editing. Do you remember the quote that we started with? Write without fear and then edit without mercy. Once you have your ideas down on the page, you need to edit, and then edit some more. And that is where the quote above becomes very relevant. Kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart. Kill your darlings. And that comes from the very well-known and prolific author Stephen King in his book on writing, A Memoir of the Craft. Remember that as you edit, you are checking for effectiveness and accuracy. Never prioritize accuracy to the point that you don't take any creative risks. So, for example, you can make no mistakes if you only ever write in very short, simple sentences, but then your writing is going to be utterly boring. Remember that you must try to avoid mistakes, but mistakes are not the end of the world, and you certainly mustn't try so hard to avoid mistakes that you just never take any risks and you write in a way that is deadly dull. In fact, mistakes are often just growing pains, and they are a sign that you're pushing yourself and being creative. So don't waste your mistakes. Learn from them, celebrate your growth, and move on. Tip number 10, edit without mercy. And you can use the following slides as a checklist for editing your writing. If you're in an exam setting and unable to read your writing out loud, read it through after you've written it and try to hear it in your head and what it would sound like if you were actually reading it out loud. Because you have to remember that good writing always reads well and communicates clearly. So if you're not in an exam setting, read your writing out loud to someone if you can. Listen to how you could improve it so that it's easier to read. And remember, if you're struggling to read it, it probably contains grammar and punctuation errors. Also, ask for honest, constructive feedback. Every good writer has a group of close friends or colleagues that they know are going to be very, very honest with them. And before they publish their work, they get that group to read their writing. It's known as their beta group or beta readers. And they get very honest and constructive feedback. So it's hard to completely see the details of your little darling. That's why it's always good to ask someone else to listen to what you've written. And then ask yourself, is the structure logical? Are the paragraphs in the best order? Have you started each new paragraph every time you've actually had anything new to speak about? Whether you've changed place, setting, character, topic, event, time, tense, speaker, all of those things are reasons for starting a new paragraph. And remember that paragraphs are fundamental because they help your reader to understand what's going on. And your job is to make your reader curious, not confused. Notice how I've started the editing process with the big picture. Focus on the overall effect of your writing first, and then work your way down to the smaller, more intricate details. Number 10, edit without mercy continued. You must check that you're writing in full sentences throughout, because if you do not, it is likely that your meaning will not be clear. Always remember that your first duty is to communicate clearly. If you do have one or two sentence fragments, that's acceptable, as long as there's a good reason for you not using a full sentence. For example, you might want to create emphasis or show that a speaker was interrupted. In terms of your tenses, you should stay in the same tense throughout your writing unless you have a very good reason for changing tenses. For example, because the logic of your writing means that you need to, or because you are using a flashback structure. And you should check all your verbs to make sure that you are staying in the correct tense and that your tense use is consistent and logical. You should usually start a new paragraph whenever you change tenses. And note that your sentence lengths have a big impact on the rhythm of your writing. Short sentences and paragraphs increase the pace or speed at which your writing is read, and they also increase tension. For example, run! Why? Run! But he's turning around and coming for us. That dialogue would consist of 5 paragraphs with lines between each of them, and the first 4 paragraphs would only contain 1 word. And it's perfectly correct, And it's also created a whole lot of tension, which I'm sure you could hear. Long sentences can also build suspense and be used to balance ideas. For example, as I sat waiting for the dentist's door to open and for him to emerge from his den, the hands of the big white waiting room clock seemed to stutter and slow as one tick followed the next. The scratch, scratch, scratch of the receptionist's pen, an irregular sniff, 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 in between breathing loudly through her mouth, seemed to be drilling holes in my brain. So ask yourself, have you used sentence lengths and different types of sentences in order to achieve the effect that you want? Here I would like to issue you with a challenge. When I've read out this passage, freeze the presentation and then have a look at how Dickens uses punctuation and sentence structure to dictate the rhythm of his writing and to create a particular effect. So read the passage out loud and think about how that varied sentence structure and punctuation affects the rhythm and makes his writing more effective. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. So stop the presentation, do a quick analysis, and then you can start again. Did you notice how Dickens uses semicolons to balance main clauses against one another and to emphasize contrast in his descriptions of Paris and London in the opening of his novel, A Tale of Two Cities? Remember, punctuation affects meaning and how your writing will be read, so you must always check it very, very carefully. Tip number 10, edit without mercy. Things you should check. Ask yourself if you're using the most accurate words, not necessarily the biggest words, and if you're spelling them correctly. Check that you're using adjectives, adverbs, and specific detail to show but not tell, and make sure that you're not overdoing them. If you have used metaphors, similes, or personification, check that they're adding to your story and that they do not just confuse the reader. Ask yourself if everything in your story is there for a reason and is making your story better. And if you have used dialogue, ask yourself if it is showing rather than telling and if it is adding to your story. You literally need to check every word and make sure that you're using the right words, not lots of words. Great writers practice economy of style. They never use more words than they have to, and every word that they include in their writing is there for a reason. And then a couple of general points about the exams. Firstly, the biggest waste of time is to write your entire essay out in full and then cross it out and change one or two words before rewriting it with 99% of the original errors. If you plan carefully and you follow the writing process throughout, that is a far, far better use of your time and will lead to far better writing. Also remember that in the matric final examination, you will never be penalized for crossing out. Markers are instructed to simply ignore crossed out words and keep reading. This means that you can cross out every second word and still get full marks. Markers are also instructed that they may not penalize learners because they have untidy handwriting. That said, if your marker has to decipher and decode your writing in order to mark it and give you a mark, they're probably going to be quite irritated, and you never want to annoy your marker or your reader. So if your writing is so heavily edited that it's really hard to read, then it is a good idea to rewrite if you have the time. But never cross out your planning or draft work until you have a final neat version that you're happy with. Because if you run out of time, you can just put a star or a similar symbol on your draft work or your planning, along with a short note to ask the marker to continue to mark on that planning or draft work. And when you've finished writing your work out neatly, then you cross out your planning and you label the neat work very clearly as your neat work. This is because it's incredibly irritating to spend ages marking writing and then turn over the page to find out that you have to start again because you've been marking the rough draft the whole time. And finally, don't spend hours counting words. Markers don't have the time to count the words in every essay that they mark. If a piece of writing looks far too long or far too short, all a marker will do is estimate how many words you write on the average line, which depends on your handwriting. And I've literally seen learners who manage 4 words a line and other learners who manage 30 words a line, and it looks like they've written with a needle. So all you do is you work out how many words the person puts on the average line and multiply that number by the number of lines they've used. And markers know that there are 30 lines on a page, so it's a very quick and easy calculation. If your writing is far too few words, you're going to penalize yourself because you wouldn't have been able to include nearly enough detail. And if your writing is wildly over length, you're probably waffling and repeating yourself, and the marker will almost definitely get irritated and take off some marks. But what you must never do is just stop writing when you hit the word count. Always finish your writing with a good conclusion, because although you might lose a few marks for going over the word count, you will definitely lose loads of marks if you hand in an incomplete essay. And if you write well enough, the chances are that the writer will neither notice nor care that you've gone a little bit over the word count. The 5th step is publishing. I guarantee you that if you work through the stages of the writing process carefully, you will improve your writing and achieve your best marks. I also hope that you look at writing as an opportunity to express yourself, share some of your life experiences and feelings as a gift to others, and as an opportunity to be creative. I hope that you realize that your voice is your gift and it is very important that you use it, and that you enjoy putting your writing out into the world. As Maya Angelou said, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. And then it's always worthwhile remembering what Henri Matisse said. He was a great artist, and he said, creativity takes courage. These are a few more tips for improving your writing. Remember that great writers read. Think about why you enjoy the writing of your favorite authors. Read them critically and ask yourself, what is it that they do that works? Identify and experiment with other authors' techniques, but always remember to write about your own content. Remember that writing is a skill and it improves with practice and confidence. So try to write regularly. For example, keep a journal or a diary and look for different forms of feedback on your writing. You could ask your friends or your family for feedback, for example. And try to write for pleasure as well as for marks. It's also a good idea to practice by setting yourself word limits, because writing short pieces is actually difficult and it makes you take every single word into account. Setting word limits will lead you to better writing. Also set yourself time limits and try free writing, which is what you did at the beginning of this planning process, where you just write down all your ideas as fast as you can. This encourages creativity, and you follow that with the rest of the writing process. Very importantly, give yourself enough time to work through the whole process. If you rush with the planning, you won't write as well. It's a great idea to keep a notebook and jot down ideas whenever and wherever you have them, or when you observe something that you think would be interesting to write about. And a good way to get yourself going with your writing is to use visual prompts, a quote, a line of dialogue, or a single word as a starting point. Look for your inspiration everywhere and try and be inspired regularly. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I've created this channel so that any learner or teacher who's working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed teaching and learning materials. If you would like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe, and pass the link on to any of your friends who would find this useful. You're also welcome to make a small donation to support this work. To do so, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you on further presentations.